Well, today, this panel is about China's structural reform. As you, most of you probably aware that China has a big meeting for the Communist Party in last November, basically laying out, I will argue, the most comprehensive economic reform for China in last 20 years at least. This panel is to try to ask the question. The question of this panel is that, can the current leadership succeed where the previous ones have failed? So you can hear that this question basically has something hidden in it. Basically, some of our assumptions are laid in these questions. Today we will have three very interesting speakers on this topic, and I know two of them pretty well, and they have pretty diverse views on this issue. Okay, sitting on my left is Dr. Xu Xiaonian. Dr. Xu is Professor of Economics and Finance at the China-Europe International Business School. Before that, he worked in CICC and Merrill Lynch, and is a very well-known and distinguished opinion leader on Chinese economy, more on the bearish front. Okay. Sitting in the middle is Professor Li Daokui. Professor Li has spoken in the earlier section already. He is a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China and the director of the Center for China in the World Economy at Tsinghua University. Dr. Li is also a very famous economist in China. Probably his view is a little bit more on the optimistic side. So, but definitely not the most optimistic among the spectrum, I will argue. There are people even more optimistic on that front. On the far left-hand side is Dr. Tim Summers. He is now the founder of XTE China Consulting, who works on Chinese politics, policy, and international relations. Tim was a diplomat, a British diplomat. Between 2004 to 2007, he was the Consulate General in Chongqing, the southwestern part of China. So he will give us a slightly different perspective on these reform issues. We decided, well, in the earlier section, I think there's a question about what are the major concerns of investors in Asia. The single biggest concern is China. I think the phrase of the question is like whether China can handle its structural reform, whatever. I think actually your concern is will China blow up? I mean, that's really the anyway, to start with, because you already have more a negative bias, so probably start with Professor Xu to, well, give you a little bit more firepower to think on this front, and then we'll try to balance it out later first. Professor Xu, your first speaker.
All right, thank you, Vincent, for telling the audience I'm bearish. As bearish as always, I'm concerned with the methodology or with the approach of the reform under the current leadership. Not so much worried about the agenda, but the approach itself. Looking back at China's history of reform era, as far as I can see, the innovations all emerged or came from the bottom, the grassroots level. So the current leadership apparently is taking an approach of top-down, okay? And I am very suspicious about the effectiveness of that top-down approach. In the history, China's reform history, as you know so well, the family in the countryside, the family responsibility system, and in the urban economy, the township village enterprises, and later on, the private entrepreneurs, and these most important institutional innovations all created at the grassroots level, okay, not top down. Well, actually, nothing came from the top, okay? But having said that, I don't mean to deny the importance of the top. but argue for a different role of the top. Okay, to me, Mr. Deng Xiaoping is a great leader. The great leader in the sense, okay, he didn't design anything. Okay, now it's a popular terminology called top design. Okay, Mr. Deng Xiaoping never did any top design, to my knowledge. Yeah, maybe something I don't know. Yeah, but to my knowledge, he didn't do any top design. Okay, and what he did, okay, is to enable people, is to break down the restrictions and create more space for the creativity of the Chinese people. Okay, so I wouldn't call him, as in the official medium, the architect of China's reform, but a great enabler. Okay, and his greatness is to turn the grassroots innovations into laws and policies and extended successful models created by the Chinese people to the whole nation. Yeah, that's where his greatness lies in, as far as I can see. The top-down approach always suffers from a credibility problem. Yeah. Last year's very comprehensive reform agenda coming out, right? And when something is too good, right? And you start suspecting, is that true? Right? It sounds like too good to be true. Okay. All the top-down reform plan, okay, has a credibility problem due to the lack of incentive and the lack of information of those planners. Okay. In the past 30 years, China reform years, some interest groups have been formed. This is no denial. Okay, vested interest everywhere you go, you can encounter. And these interest groups began to pursue their own goals, okay? And among them, the biggest is the government itself, okay? Now, we are facing a reform dilemma, okay? The reform dilemma is, can we really rely on the officials to draft a reform plan that would severely undercut their own interest? Okay, put it in other words, okay, on the one hand, we depend on the government to push forward reform. On the other hand, all the reforms will hurt the interest of various groups within the government. So such a reform plan has credibility? It's up to you to judge, okay? And a recent example is state banks. Yeah, it's the state banks with the support of the central, with the support of the regulator, right? Boycott the financial innovations on internet. That tells you how powerful the interest groups are today and how difficult, for the grassroots level of innovations to succeed. Okay, so you are telling me, okay, let's wait for the top to give us a perfect blueprint, a future plan for reforms. How could I take it seriously when I see this vested interest blocking innovations at the grassroots level? How could I give them credit? Okay, it is very hard. Yeah, it is very hard for me. Yeah, the recent incidences showed very clearly how unrealistic to count on the bureaucrats to push forward reforms. So, as I said, my concern is more on the approach, more on the methodology, rather than on the agenda itself. Okay.
Before we turn to another,
Yeah.
How do you think the government can enable the bottom-up forces?
Enable, look at Deng Xiaoping. Yeah, look at Deng Xiaoping. Mr. Deng Xiaoping said, I don't care it is socialism or capitalism, whatever it is, okay? As long as it can enhance the productivity, we should give it a chance to try. Okay, this kind of attitude, yeah, if the government adopt, well, then I will be, I will no longer be bearish.
Okay.
Okay, I would turn bullish the next day.
Okay.
Yeah, the next day. Okay, you need to give me some reasons, right? For me to become bullish.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So I do need some reasons. Okay, well, my second point is even if the bureaucrats truly for the benefit of society, okay, not to protect their own interest, truly for the benefit of society, they do not know where and how to make necessary reforms. Yeah, because they are so far away from the market. So far away from market, right? Alibaba, financial innovations, that kind of thing, and Tengxun, WeChat, I don't think that the bureaucrats can ever make an innovation like that, okay? Because number one, they don't have incentive. Number two, they don't have information. They don't know how the market works, okay? That's where we need the entrepreneurs, okay? So if we stick to the top-down approach, okay? It doesn't matter what your reform agenda is. I see little hope to succeed. Not to mention the information we need to put that reform plan into work, in the place, in the process of execution. Okay, so yes, okay, I will finish pretty soon. Okay. The reasons, okay, why China started the economic reform 30 years ago, because we do not believe in a centrally planned economy. For the same reason, I do not believe in a centrally planned reform. For the same reasons, okay, it's the same. Yeah, we get rid of central planning because it didn't work. And for centrally planned reforms, why should I believe it would work? Okay, I don't see no reasons. So what we need to do is to empower the people rather than the ministries. Yeah, what we need to do is to remove rather than impose restrictions on what people can do. Get back to Deng Xiaoping's way. Then I see some hope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. David?
Well, first, let me thank Vincent for being a very gracious host who lent me his jacket. I came here I forgot my jacket, so that I don't look too worse in front of my good friend and my intellectual rival, Xiao Nian. So I've lived up this reputation of this jacket, right? Vincent, thank you. Let me say that reform is always a complicated thing. It's not a revolution. It's not a revolution. So I think all reforms, all successful reforms have to have two ingredients. Number one, popular demand at the grassroots level, which China had 35 years ago when we were young in college. Everybody felt that without reform, China had no hope. Today, same thing. Lots of discontent at the grassroots level, with corruption, with air pollution, with surplus production, with difficulties finding jobs for college graduates, 72 million of them each year. Same, no difference. Second ingredient for a successful reform is visionary leader on the top, who is able to galvanize support at the local level and to transform the popular demand into an agenda to implement the reform. Because this is not revolution. Otherwise, just overthrow the government, change the government. That's revolution, right? So the issue is, who are the leaders today? are they able to galvanize or transform the popular discontent into a meaningful agenda? So I argue that today we have the best hope of the past 20, maybe 25 years to have a success of reform. By the way, don't read too much of the official documents, which I don't even know how to read sometimes. You'll have to really go beyond the document. On this, I fully agree with Xiaonian. So who are the leaders today? I think they are having three distinct features, personalities, different from the previous generation of leaders. Number one, these guys went through the hardship of Cultural Revolution. They were peasants. They were manual workers before going to college. So they know and they knew what was going on at the grassroots level, what the general public need. Second, these guys went through their formal education, college education, when China was in a honeymoon with reform. That was the years of late 70s and early 80s. And Xiaonian and I were, belong to that generation, right? We were in college, and the reform was the key catchword at that time. So I think deeply, deeply in their mind, they have a commitment. They have a belief that reform is the medicine to cure fundamental problems of the Chinese society and the economy. The third interesting feature of these people is that they all have, most of them, at the very top level, they have practical experiences in local regions in China, unlike the previous generation of leaders. For example, Xi Jinping worked as a county mayor in a province neighboring Beijing, in Hebei province. Later on, he worked in coastal provinces in Fujian, in Zhejiang, in Shanghai. All of these are not only coastal provinces, but also the most dynamic economic and socially regions in China. Li Keqiang worked in Henan province, also worked in Liaoning province, both of which are huge provinces. So they, out of 7 people in the standing committee of the Communist Party, I think at least 6 had extensive local experiences. I often compare this with the previous generation in which Wen Jiabao, I think he's a decent guy, but did not have any provincial experience. All of his whole political career, he spent close to 30 years in Zhongnanhai, Chinese White House, right? And also, interestingly, I can't help but comparing Xi Jinping with Obama. As far as I know, Obama did not have any experiences running any government except for the federal government, which is facing challenges from the White House, from the Capitol Hill. Anyway, so these 3 things I think are important. And on top of this, there's also a difference between this government and the previous government in the sense that these governments are led by people who are the second generation of the revolution veterans. Therefore, they have a sense that in their hands, they have to do something in order for the country and in order for the party to be able not only to survive, but do something well, right? The previous generation were excellent students, one of them from my university, Tsinghua University, A+ students, and trying to implement whatever, right, policies from the top. That's the difference. So therefore, we are observing that the leaders are now trying to do, in my description, which I mentioned in my previous session, a sandwich approach to reform. It's not a top-down approach. I don't think it's top-down. Nobody can do a top-down research, top-down reform nowadays in China. Nobody had the power as Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping to implement any top-down reform. Instead, a sandwich approach, that is to issue a popular agenda of reform and to call upon the support of the grassroots level, right, who are having their WeChat, their Weibo, and their other means of voicing opinions. So start with the most popular reform, anti-corruption reform. Very popular, right? And then move on, carry the momentum to other reforms. On top, they have commitment to reform. At the grassroots level, calls for reform, and then squeeze the middle part. The middle part are some of the corrupt local officials and some of the bureaucrats in China's various government agencies. and in some of the state-owned enterprises. That's the dynamism of the new round of reform. And I do think that there is a hope for this dynamism or sandwich approach to succeed. Now, I don't mean that all the 60 points in the third plenum will be implemented item by item. Instead, there will be a sequence of the reform. Some reforms will be done first, followed by others. One example is financial reform. The thing which surprised me about the Alibaba or the Yuebao is not that there are government officials coming up against this new initiative. The surprising thing is that today, up to today, Yuebao is still operating. It's not shut down. Most likely it will continue, right? It will continue to be there, and other funds will continue. That's already a big achievement, right? We can talk about the refined regulations of Alibaba and Yuebao, but why it's not there? Why it's still there, not abolished? Because that's popular. That's popular. Hundreds of thousands or even millions of depositors are putting money there. That's the source of other reforms. That's momentum for other reforms. So let me stop here by saying that we are in a new era of the political economy of reform, and this new era has to be better understood in order for us to have any meaningful forecast of the future success or the lack of it of the reform. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Tim, you have a real working experiences in dealing with Chinese government officials when you were the Consul General in Chongqing. What do you see when you hear about the top-down and the bottom approach, which the two of them, Xiaonian and David, are discussing? How do you see about China's reform? Are you positive or negative about it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Vincent. First of all, thanks very much for hosting the panel. I think there's both top-down and bottom-up in China's policymaking and reform. I wanted to structure my comments around 4 very basic questions about a reform agenda in China. First of all, who? So the politics of this. Secondly, why? Thirdly, what? And fourthly, how? So to start with the politics, which I've called the who of reform, I think the real significance of this third plenum meeting last November was the political signal it sent. This was a strong statement, the strongest statement you could have possible from the top of the Communist Party, that reform was the overriding priority. Now, the idea of reform had been rather diluted, I think, over the last 10 years, but it's now back as the umbrella concept, the overriding concept for policy making in China. So from the top of the party, the politics are aligned. I agree with what some of the other speakers have said, that there's also strong popular support, grassroots support for reform. And it's interesting that the leadership itself has referenced that, and the State Council have talked about popular sentiment for reform over the last year. And this is a classic tactic of political elites who want to deliver reform. You appeal to the grassroots over the heads of the vested interests to take your reform agenda forward. So it fits into a sort of pattern in the literature. I think perhaps worth saying a little bit more about vested interests, given that particularly Professor Xu has raised this as an obstacle to reform. I mean, certainly there are vested interests in China, as there are in every system. But here I see that I'm actually quite positive on this story. And I think this is really a political story. Goes back to Xi Jinping and the new leadership taking over the top of the Communist Party in November 2012. To quite a strong and clear and smooth transition of leadership. I think the anti-corruption campaign is absolutely key here. And although we read all the gossip about Zhou Yongkang and all of these other individuals, I think the anti-corruption campaign is about more than personalities. It's about policy primarily. Policy is much more important than personalities. And the targeting of state-owned enterprises in particular, whether it's PetroChina or others in this anti-corruption campaign, sends a signal to the vested interests. You better fall in line, otherwise you could be next. So I think the politics, the first point I want to make, are very strongly aligned, I think, for a reform agenda. Second question, why? Well, I think some of this has been referenced already, and certainly there's a sense of crisis. If you read what Xi Jinping said in his, or what's been reported about what he said in his remarks at the third plenum in November, he goes through this long list of almost every problem you could possibly imagine in China, unbalanced economy, the environment, debt, government finance, everything is there. The only thing that's not there is whether the political system needs change or not. But almost every other problem has been identified. So there is this sense that, I think, as Professor Lee said, if reform doesn't happen now, then things really could fall apart, if not soon, then at some point in the future. But I also see a second motivation for reform among the leadership in China, and this is more of a longer-term ambition. There's some interesting references in Li Keqiang's government work reports to China wanting to catch up with and overtake the global leaders in certain sectors, new materials, mobile telecommunications. There's a few other sectors that are mentioned there. And I think the other reason for the other motivation for reform is this ambition to move China to a next level, not just to the next level economically, but to make China a potentially world-leading economy. Now, that concept, I think, needs some serious challenge. I mean, whether we still have leading economies in the rest of the 21st century, I don't know. I mean, I'm quite skeptical that any economy actually can really claim that status over the next 20 or 30 years. But I think the idea is strong in Chinese political elites, and it's driving this reform agenda. The third question is the what. What do we mean by reform? Now, this is not just economic reform. I think that's a really important point to make. The key word for me is comprehensive deepening of reform. That's what the policy documents talk about. And if you look at the structures that have been set up, economy is only part of this. It's the biggest part, but it's only part. We have social reform. We have reform in cultural areas. We have defense. The defense apparatus is undergoing its own reform process through a committee chaired by Xi Jinping. We have reform stretching across a wide range of areas. Now, we'll probably come back to the economy a bit more in our discussion, but one of those other areas I want to highlight is governance. And I think one of the other key drivers in this reform is the idea that governance needs to be improved in China. And this, I think, actually is the reason why some really actually fairly minor things have been given so much play in the press. Let me give you an example. The so-called one-child policy, or changes to family planning policy. Actually, the changes proposed are not very significant at all. It's not going to have much of an impact on China's demographic structure for a long time. Why is it significant? It's significant because it speaks to popular sentiment about what has been, for many people, a deeply unpopular policy in its implementation, even if people actually tend to agree that it's probably been good for China's economy over the last 30 years. So there's a number of areas, I think, where governance is driving what's going on. Lead finally onto the how, the implementation question. Well, firstly, and here I think top-down is important in China, the very fact of saying that reform is the top priority is itself beginning an implementation of reform. There's a sort of exhortatory nature to Chinese policymaking. When the top leader says something is good, there's an inclination within the system to try and fall in behind that, or at least to use that concept to further your own interests within that system. So there's a clear top-down message of implementation, which is important. But then I think when we look at what has actually been done, and here I think Li Keqiang and the State Council is probably the most interesting area over the last year. The economic message of reform was more market. The market should play a decisive role. How do you do that? I think what the government has actually done is said, right, we'll take that and we'll say less state. So the implementation of more market has been less state. And this is what has driven the removal of approvals at the central government level, the removal of administrative fees, and so on at both central and local government levels throughout the country. And so part of the implementation is through this, reducing the ability of the state to intervene in economic decision making. Now, that may be positive. I mean, there's definitely some reform dividends to be gained from that. Businesses can register more easily. The tax reforms that go alongside that are probably beneficial to businesses. This can unleash some entrepreneurial space. This is the grassroots, bottom-up element. But it also requires a very big change management program within the Chinese Communist Party. And I think for me, this is the biggest challenge that is faced. You know, we have this party of 80 million people, or we have however many tens of millions of government officials across China. The mindsets, the culture, the ways of operating at local, at provincial, as well as at central government levels need to change if this reform agenda is to go forward. So I don't have too many worries about what's happening from the top down, but I think that this change management, it's like a sort of organizational change management program, is probably the biggest challenge that is facing the reform agenda. And that's one which I think is very, very difficult for this leadership to push through quickly or easily.
Well, thank you, Tim. Well, we can definitely now leave the question to the floor. Indeed, Tim, I'm always very puzzled about how to manage a political party of 18 million people, which is more than the population of Germany. I always think that this is an issue. This is an issue we need to deal with at some point. But anyway, well, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands. If you don't mind, I ask the first question because. Okay, it seems that here, all of you, it seems that we have a lot of issues like half glass empty, half glass full type of discussion. But I'd like to switch the topic a little bit. It's like, okay, if we assume based on the current agenda model of reform going on, in your view, and usually in reform process, there are a lot of accidents and nasty things happening along the way. Even the best implemented reform have this type of problem. If based on the current set of situation, in next 1 year or 1 to 2 years, do you see some meaningful risks or some meaningful accidents could happen in the Chinese economy, maybe in the form of a financial crisis larger than expected, or a very substantial economic slowdown, or political crisis, whatever? What do you see to be the major risks along the road in next 1 to 2 years? Xiaonan, you want to?
Well, I think the investors all have seen that, right? The major risk of Chinese economy. That is the property market, okay, and local government debt, and bank assets, quality of bank assets. Yeah, these three things are actually one. Yeah, it's the over leveraging of the economy. Yeah, too much debt in the economy. So the kind of debt crisis with Chinese characteristics, I expect that crisis not too big, not too small, to trigger reforms. Before that happens, okay, no reforms, just talking, okay. So I would like to take this opportunity to respond to my friend's comments, right? To David's comments.
Okay, please.
Yeah, about the quality, about the character of this leadership. Yeah. It reminds me a repetitive phenomenon, in the modern China. Every time when we have a new government, right, we tell us, okay, believe me, right, this time is really different. Okay, I heard this, in the early years of the last government. Okay, I heard this in the early years of the government before the previous government. Okay, every time we comfort ourselves. Okay, this time is different, right? There's a famous book, with the title, "This Time is Different," talking about the financial crisis in human history in the past 800 years. Every financial crisis before the bubble bursting, people said, the bubble will keep going. This time is different, right? Okay, it turned out every bubble is the same, right? The bubble is the same, okay? Now we're hearing this again, okay? This leadership is different. Indeed, yeah, it's different. Yeah, different people. Of course, yeah, different, okay? But, okay, our thinking focused on the quality of leadership, focused on the character's ability of the leadership, itself reflects a big defect of the system.
True.
Okay?
Sure.
We rely on individual leaders. If we had Deng Xiaoping again, that would be, we are so lucky, right? And without Deng Xiaoping, the reform process stopped. So do we need to do something with the institutions? And that institutions play less weight on individual leaders, okay? And that institution or institutional system, okay, can create large room for the people, for their creativity, and to drive China's economic growth, okay? And related issue is the reform agenda so far, nothing about judicial reform, right? Nothing about the legal reform, nothing about the political reform, okay? Any of you in this audience believes today's China, we can solve economic issues without touching upon political and legal system? Anyone believe that? I don't, okay? If you are really serious about economic reform, you cannot get around legal reform and political reform.
Tim, it seems that you are very active.
Yeah, well, I just, if may just comment a little bit on a couple of Professor Su's remarks. I mean, I totally agree that, that legal judicial reform, the legal system is very important in the longer run. It's got an important regulatory function in every economy. But I'm not sure it's, if you'll forgive me, quite accurate to say that there's nothing about judicial reform that's come out of the third plenum. I mean, there is some material on judicial and legal reform. There's not a huge amount of detail at this stage, but talking about reducing the ability of governments at the same level to influence the judicial process. Now, this is not judicial reform in the sense of a separation of powers like you have in the United States or somewhere, but it is a response to the ability of, or the problems that come from local governments, that are, or local parties, perhaps we should say, interfering in the judicial process. So I think that problem has been identified. How easy it is to deliver and what's going to happen, I think, remains to be seen. So we need to keep an open mind about this. Again, it feeds back to this issue of governance. And it's interesting the way that Xi Jinping has talked about that. He's talked about popular dissatisfaction with the judicial process in China. And so that, again, has been a driver of reform in this area.
Yeah, may I quickly add 2 quick points? Okay, first, I think we're lowering our standard of debate by referring to the past forecasts. Actually, there's a even longer history of people forecasting China will collapse for the past 30 years, ever since 1978. Look at what happened in the past 35 years. Yet, the system has been continuously evolving, improving. The economy has been continuously growing, although there are tremendous problems, Asian financial crisis, the crisis of 1989, all over, right? So I guess looking at the past history of forecasts is not that helpful, right? Now, the other things that I want to mention that we really have to see what's actually going on in the economy, right? I really envy Xiaonian's past few months staying in a beautiful spot in the world, California, right? Stanford. I wish I could do that. But doing that, you know, in Beijing, I've been hearing all these things going on the legal reform. Yes, reform going on. The government is now implementing reform, let all sub-provincial courts to be independent budget-wise, and personnel-wise. So far, until now, all the personnel, all the budget of local courts below provincial level are on the same on the budget of the province, right? That's one reform going on, even though it's not the same as the complete independence of the court. Political reform, announcement already made to let upper level party discipline inspection agency to be supervising lower level government officials, instead letting the same level of party inspection, of disciplinary inspection committee supervising the same level. That's reform. So political reform is not a democracy, it's not popular vote. Instead, the tremendous amount of nuances, tremendous details, which have to be implemented one by one. So on this point, let me quickly say that we have a British friend here. I think China is most likely going on an evolutionary process in politics, in economics, like the British one, rather than having another revolution like the French Revolution, because people are tired of revolutions. Too many revolutions. People want to see a peaceful and gradual process of improvement, whether it's in politics or economic institutions. I do think that's the general preference of the population. Not me, not you, the population.
So David, do you see any risks in the process? Because
of course, lots of problems. There's no way to have no problems. Look at the past 35 years, lots of non-stop. Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, 89 problem, 85 inflation. The problem I see right now in the coming years, local public finance. Local public finance is now covered up by various means, especially by the financial sector. So there will be a disruption or eruption of crisis in local governments, which I agree with Xiaonian is good. It is necessary to clean up the whole system, not only the financial system, but also the political system.
Okay, who has a question? This gentleman here.
Hi, this is just a follow-up question to the point you just raised. Local government debt, I mean, it is a necessary part of reform, but handled poorly, it could cause mass panic, not just within China, but in global financial markets. We'd just love if all three of you could sort of expand on this topic. Thank you.
David, it seems that I heard that you have a very specific proposal for it.
Yes, I do think that local public debt is now #1 problem, which is linked to the financial system, linked to the property market bubble. However, I do not think this problem to be as explosive as the 2008 or 2009 global financial crisis, because overall, that Chinese economy is still having 50% of national savings rate. Overall, the central government is only having 15% of public debt as share of GDP, and the institutional investors like you are still wanting to buy the central government debt. There's not enough supply of central government-backed fixed income instruments. So there, I do see a procedure for the central government to issue more central government debt and then set up a fund to do orderly or pre-announced procedure of restructuring of some of the potential local public finance crisis.
As an investor, you might want to get some money ready to buy distressed assets or distressed debt. Okay, it's good time.
So you think, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Kim, do you have anything to add on the local government debt issue?
I think just very briefly, I feel that the problems that have accumulated so far are serious problems, but they're probably manageable. The real question is, going forward, can things change? And we saw from 2010 to 2013, between those two National Audit Office reports, local government debt continued to grow after the problem had already been identified. That's a bit of a concern to me. So going forward, is the government going to be able to do things differently to stop this problem growing in size? That's the thing to watch.
Hi. Before March, there were some rumors that NDRC will be removed. My question is, what does the panel think? That should NDRC be removed? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
Oh, I always argue for dismantling of NDRC. Yeah, NDRC almost extincted. Yeah, until the Asian financial crisis, and the Central Planning Committee, there's a plan to shut down that institution completely. But in the Asian financial crisis, the Chinese government needs to conduct expansionary fiscal policy. to stimulate the economy. So they call back those guys leaving. They were leaving the office. Call them back. Can you do this for us? And those guys said, yeah, well, we will try our best. Okay, so gradually, okay, it developed into the most powerful commission in China, and that is left over of the central planning. So even in the conference open to public in Guangdong, I said, to reform the Chinese economy, first thing, shut down NDRC.
Well, very quickly, I don't think the NDRC will be shut down in the near future. However, the function of NDRC has already been changed, reducing tremendously their role in disapproving private investment projects, which was a major course for the recovery in the later part of next year. And again, this year, I'm looking at a possible recovery again by further reducing this role.
Yeah, I agree with that. Perhaps also NDRC will look for ways to reinvent itself, maybe coordinating other cross-cutting ideas like urbanization policy, which is a big focus of the government. So there'll be other areas that they'll be active in.
An important consideration for investors in Asia is geopolitical risk. Nearly all of leaders in Northeast Asia are new and assertive and ambitious. With regard to China, there's a concern that the reform process could incentivize the government to become more assertive internationally with its neighbors. Do you see a link between the ambitious reform process in China and the likelihood of military conflict between China and its neighbors? Thank you.
I think broadly, no, I don't see a link between the reform process and the likelihood of conflict or even Chinese foreign policy. But I mean, Chinese foreign policy, I think, has its own drivers. And they're drivers to do with the rise, the reemergence of China as a major power. They're drivers to do with response to what's going on elsewhere in the region, I mean, particularly in Japan, response to the US, how the US-China relationship works out. I think there's a number of things going on in that foreign policy space that is rather separate from the domestic reform process. I think Chinese foreign policy is becoming more assertive or firmer. But I think that's probably a natural consequence of the way that power is shifting in the world, and we either have to work out how to live with it or not.
Hi, I have a question. So you were talking about the debt level being very high in some perspectives in China, and the need for restructuring. How large share of the total debt do you think will need to be restructured?
Wonderful question. It's a wonderful question. I don't think the debt level per se is a variable which you can compare across countries. We really have to take into account the national savings rate. By the way, the US has 200% leverage credit to GDP ratio, whereas the national savings rate at most by far, is 20%. China, 50% national savings rate versus 250% of leverage rate. So I would say that it is a structure of the debt which has to be done properly. I would see a much more share of the total debt, total credit in the form of debt rather than the bank loans. So I would like to see great reduction in bank loans, in the stock of bank loans.
Hi, my question is directed at Dr. Lee. There's research show that, with financial liberalization, capital account liberalization, there's more pronounced boom-bust cycle, more volatile capital flows out of country. Can you share with us, what is PBOC's and the government's thinking behind capital account liberalization? Why is it placing so high priority on it that you see 3 years is going to be, fully liberalized when you have problems with local government debt and other issues, which potentially, if you liberalize your financial account so quickly, then you could create more problems and risk for China going forward?
There are two camps within the policymaker body. One camp says, no, never liberalize the capital account until 20 or 20 years later. I know people, right? We know all the names, right? Very cautious. The other side, I think right now, pretty dominant side is say we should speed up the capital account convertibility because there's so many issues, including the exchange rate regime depends upon that. Also, there's an efficiency issue because Chinese investors are trapped domestically where the rate of return of financial markets is very low. So there's need for them to get more benefits overseas. But what I would forecast, what I think would happen, will be the middle ground. That there will be an orderly opening up of the capital account. For example, like hedge funds. First allow people who have net worth over 5 million RMB deposit to take 20% of their money into overseas market, and then to announce if within 1 week as much as 200 million US dollar goes out, let's stop the process. So that middle ground policy is very likely to happen in the coming 2 or 3 years.
Okay, I think we need to wrap up because the time is over. Thank you very much for the three speakers. Very interesting debate. Thank you.